Hello everyone. In this video, I would analyze an article from the Hindu. Now, this article is about India's rising trade deficit and the consequent weakening of the currency. So students, in this video, the points that I would cover would be India's widening trade and current account deficit, one. I would throw some light on balance of payment, balance of trade, trade deficit, the complicated view of trade deficit, the link between trade deficit and economic growth, the pros and cons of trade deficit, and why does a trade deficit weaken the currency, students? Because the main point made in this particular article is that because of India's rising trade deficit for quite some time now, the India's currency is depreciating, it's losing its value. So we would try and understand the link between the trade deficit and the currency, that as to why the currency depreciates when the trade deficit rises. So let's get started. Now, students, this article is titled "A Matter of Import on Spectre of Wider Trade and Current Account Deficit." So the article says that India's monthly merchandise trade deficit hit a fresh record of $25.6 billion in June. That means our merchandise trade deficit. What is merchandise trade deficit, students? The trade in visibles, the trade in goods. Our merchandise trade deficit has hit a fresh record of $25.6 billion in June. That means it is at one of the all-time highs. The trade deficit has widened to all-time high, students. In June, the value of outbound shipment grew 16.8%, marginally slower than the 20.6%. So our outbound shipments have decreased in the month of June. And this is the third successive month of moderation, students. That means our exports have been declining, have been reducing for the past 3 months back to back, students. Like it says, 3 successive months of moderation. Now, something that is very worrying, a worrying trend, is that 4 of India's top 10 export items, that means items in which we are among the best in the world, that means, wherein we export a lot: engineering goods, cotton yarn, drugs, and pharma and plastic product, students. Even these goods the export of these goods have contracted, less alone the goods in which we are less competitive. It's not just in those items, in terms of those items, but even the export items which are one of our best export items, the topmost export items, students, like engineering goods, cotton yarn, drug, pharma, plastic, our exports have contracted in these goods also. Next, students, even as exports growth slid, imports surged by over 51% to $63.6 billion, crossing the $60 billion mark for the 4th month in a row, students. So even as our exports are sliding, are reducing, our imports have been surging, students. Our imports have been increasing, and it has surged by over 51% to $63.6 billion in June, right? So this is in fact a very worrying trend, that our exports are declining, our imports are increasing, and this would precisely lead to the widening of the trade deficit. Now, like it says, students, the coal imports up almost 242% year on year, and petroleum inflows up 94.2% drove nearly 3/4 of this surge, students. So what has led to an inflation, or what has inflated our import bill, students, right? What are the primary items whose imports have increased? So number one, coal, petroleum, and as you read the next point, the gold imports, students. So our coal imports are up by almost 242%, and petroleum, students, so primarily the energy products, students, our fuel, right? And of course the gold. So we all know that India has this huge appetite for gold, and in spite of various measures that the government has taken to curb the import of gold so as to contain the rising import bill, but our gold import, students, have been increasing consistently for past several months. The trade deficit as a result, students, adds up to a record $70.25 billion. You should know these figures, students, right? So our our trade deficit is it has added up to a record $70.25 billion, which is over 2 times higher than a year ago. So this is indeed a very worrying trend, students. This is a matter of worry, a matter of concern, that our import bill is rising, and the trade deficit has widened to double up than last year. So it has almost doubled up than what it was a year ago. Next, students, the tangible slowdown in exports due to weaker global demand is unlikely to change much soon, with recession or sharp growth slowdowns expected in several developed markets. So what the author here says, that look, our exports are not likely to increase in the near future or anytime soon, because there is a global weak demand. That is one. And secondly, students, several countries, particularly the developed countries like US, are on the verge of a recession. So we don't have much hope there that we can sort of contract or decrease our trade deficit by increasing the exports. Now, if you look at the imports, our domestic demand for import of oil, fertilizer, coal, and even gold particularly because that's a very safe haven for investor students, is largely inelastic. Inelastic as in what is inelastic? That we have an inelastic demand for these imports. That means they would not change really. These demands don't really hinge on any external factors. We would have a high demand for oil, fertilizers, coal, and even gold, students, because we know that India doesn't produce much of energy domestically. So we're reliant for our energy needs on the foreign countries. And gold, of course, like I said, we have a huge appetite for gold, and particularly in the tumultuous finance markets when there is a like a slowdown going on. So people look at gold as a viable investment option. So given these factors, students, the imports would also not decrease, which means our exports are not rising in the near future. Our imports are not declining, right? So this would lead to increase in the trade deficit, right? And hence, like the article says, the weakening of rupee, students. So basically, the main point made in this article is that all of this trade deficit that we have incurred as a country, that would lead to weakening of the rupee, which has tumbled further to 79.37, students, vis-a-vis the US dollar on Tuesday, and it would raise the import cost further, students, right? So the last Tuesday, the rupee has tumbled to 79.37 per dollar. So robust forex reserves, notwithstanding the persistent outflows of foreign capital from the financial markets, have triggered concerns about the balance of payment situation. So what has this eventually led to? This has led to concerns. This has triggered concerns about the balance of payment situation. We will look at what BOP is in a while. So, the final point that the author makes, that even though India has sound forex reserves, I did this in one of the previous videos, that India's forex reserves are in fact at an all-time high, but the persistent outflow of foreign capital, students, because we are importing a lot and there's not a parallel increase in exports. So there's a persistent outflow of foreign capital. Our foreign exchange reserves are depleting, right? And this has triggered concerns about balance of payment situation. So what the government has done now, so in order to fight this situation, this challenging situation, the government has placed restrictions on petroleum products exports and acknowledged that gold imports were hurting the current account by raising the custom duties. So government has placed a ban on or restrictions on the export of petroleum products. The government has also increased the custom duties for on gold, so that importing gold becomes expensive. And coal imports, on the other hand, are expected to keep hitting record highs as monsoons will affect the domestic output. So there's not much that can be done about the coal imports, because we are expecting a weak monsoon that they are likely to increase. And policymakers may have little room to maneuver out of this vicious cycle, but missteps must be avoided, and domestic inefficiencies hurting the exports should be reviewed urgently, students, right? So the author says that the policymakers don't have much room for maneuvering, right? They don't have much room to take any significant considerable steps to contain or to fight the situation. So what it can focus on is to avoid the inefficiencies, right? So that we can minimize our exports, our imports. And all of this, the specter of wider trade and current account deficit, this is the most important point made by the author in this article, it is dragging the rupee down. That means the trade deficit is exerting a downward pressure, a downward influence on our rupee. Our rupee is weakening, it is depreciating vis-a-vis the dollar, right? Now, students, let's quickly understand. The author said that the trade deficit has led to, it has led to or triggered the concerns of the balance of payment situation. So what is BOP, students? The balance of payment, I would take this up briefly because I've done this, covered this in one of the previous videos. So very briefly, the balance of payment of a country is a systematic record of all economic transactions between the residents of the reporting country and the residents of foreign countries during a given period of time. So what is BOP? BOP is a record of all the economic transaction that happens between one country and the other country, right? That happens between one country and all the other foreign countries. This is balance of payment, and this is usually, it is considered on an annual basis. So now, students, if you look at this, this is the balance of payment table. Now, if you see here, on the left-hand side, we've got the receipts, which is the credit side, and on the other side, we've got the payments, which is the debit side. Now, if you look at the trade accounts, basically, students, the balance of payment, it is primarily made up of the current account and the capital account. So if you look at the current account, students, current account includes the trade account. Please understand this, right? So what is trade account, students? Trade account includes the export of goods and the imports of goods. Basically, it includes the trade of the visibles, of the merchandise, right? And if you look at the current account, it includes the export of services as well, interest, profits, and dividends, and unilateral receipts, students. So what is unilateral receipts? Unilateral receipts include unilateral transfers, one-way transfers. For example, the gifts and donations or the aid that we get from the foreign countries and what we make to the foreign countries. Because obviously, see, when you are buying a good from a foreign country, you would give them currency in exchange of that. But when a foreign country sends you aid, you're not giving anything in return, right? So such transfers are known as unilateral transfers. So if you look at the current account, students, it includes the trade account, which includes the goods, trade in goods. It also includes the trade in services. It includes interest, profits, and dividends, right? That means the income that the government earns or the residents earn from their investment abroad and vice versa. And unilateral receipts, which is unilateral transfers, right? So this is your current account. And then, of course, we have capital account, students, which includes the foreign investments, right? This includes the FDI, particularly short-term borrowings, medium and long-term borrowing, students. Okay. And if you look at the other side, it includes the investment that we have made abroad, and the short-term lending and the medium and long-term lending. So these are the items of the capital account. Now, students, here we spoke about the trade deficit, right? So it concerns the current account. So current account, students, is inclusive, like I said, of the trade account as well. So it is this trade account that, India runs a deficit in. That means our import of goods, if you look at the right-hand side, is much more than our export of goods. That means it is getting debited to a large extent than it is getting credited, right? So it is here that we run a trade deficit. Because of this, our current account balance is also runs in deficit. And because of this, our overall BOP also runs into a deficit, right? So if you see the last bit, it says that the total receipts should be equal to total payments, right? But when this is not the case, then there's an imbalance. Like in this case, the payment side, the debit side is much more. Our payments are much more than our receipts, and hence there is a trade deficit, students. There's an overall worrying BOP situation. Okay. Now coming to balance of trade. So what is balance of trade, students? It is the difference between a country's value of exports and value of imports over a certain period of time. It is called balance of trade, or BOT, students, right? That means the difference between countries' values of exports and the value of imports. Balance of trade is an important component of a country's balance of payment. A positive balance of trade indicates country's trade surplus, right? Which means if the receipts of the trade account, students, it is higher, right? So it would be a trade surplus. That means if you're exporting more than we are importing, it would be a trade surplus. However, if there could be a negative balance of trade if we are importing more than we are exporting. Now, this simply means that when a country imports more goods than it exports, it experiences a trade deficit. And when a country exports more goods than it imports, it experiences a trade surplus. Trade deficit, very briefly. In the simplest terms, the trade deficit occurs when a country imports more than it exports. Right? Repeating, when do we face a trade deficit? When we are importing more than we are exporting. Now, the question arises, students, that is trade deficit good or bad? Right? So the answer to this is that a trade deficit is neither inherently good, right, or inherently bad. Although very large deficits can negatively impact the economy. So even though very large trade deficit have some serious negative consequences for any economy, it cannot be said that trade deficit is always bad, students. A trade deficit can be a sign of strong economy also, and under certain conditions can lead to stronger economic growth for the deficit running country in the future, right? So students, here a very good example is that of US, which consistently runs a trade deficit vis-a-vis other countries, but yet it has a very strong economy. So I would take that example as a classic example of a country being economically strong and yet being, yet running a trade deficit. So the complicated view of trade deficit, students. To many in the world of economies, though, a trade deficit is about an imbalance between countries' saving and investment rates, right? It means a country is spending more money on imports than it makes on exports. And under the rules of economic account, it must make up for the shortfall, students, right? So what is said here? This means that, you see, when a country runs trade deficit, it means it is importing more than it is exporting. So our payments are more than our receipts, right? But students, think, if we are running a trade deficit for over a very long period of time, our foreign exchange reserves would keep depleting, right? Would keep thinning. How would we fund our imports after a while? Right? If our payments are more than our receipts, or if in other words, if our expenditure is more than our earnings, how will we continue to, fund our expenditure or important, things that we need to buy? Right? Similarly, if a country is consistently running a trade deficit, it is importing more than it is exporting, how will it fund its exports, the import of crucial items like, say, petroleum and fuel, energy, commodities after a while, we will run out of foreign exchange. That means any country would start borrowing after a point in order to fund its imports, right? We need to earn foreign exchange reserve, students, in order to spend it. But if we continually keep spending it without earning it, after a point, it will lead to a crisis, a macroeconomic crisis. We would not have sufficient foreign exchange reserves to even fund some of our basic needs like oil, petroleum, something we are reliant on foreign countries for. This is precisely what has happened in Sri Lanka, students. Sri Lanka is facing a crisis, a macroeconomic crisis. It is because it has run out of foreign exchange reserves, and they don't have the forex to meet even some of its most basic needs like energy needs, because of which the entire country, the industries in particular, have come to a standstill, right? So students, here it is said that any given account, like when you maintain accounts, a BOP, for example, it needs to be balanced, right? So if a country is importing more, that means it's spending more of foreign exchange reserves. It will have to, in order to balance it or make up for it, it will have to borrow from the foreign countries, right? Or it would try to invite foreign investment so that country gets enough foreign exchange reserves, students, right? So in order to meet for this shortfall, students, to cover this gap of more payments and less receipts, any country will have to increase its borrowing or increase its foreign direct investment, as in, invite more countries or attract more countries to invest in the country. Now, if the borrowed money or foreign investment is used wisely, such as investment in productivity growth, okay? So now the foreign exchange that we are borrowing, students, the foreign exchange that we are attracting, we are getting, if we invest this foreign exchange wisely in productive, resources, then a trade deficit can be positive for a country, students, right? Then that is an investment. For example, US runs a trade deficit, but for several decades in the 1800s, the money went into railroads and other public infrastructure, which helped the US to develop economically, students. So whatever money we are borrowing or whatever foreign exchange we are getting, if we invest that wisely, productively, then of course the trade deficit can actually lead to gains for a country, otherwise not. Now, students, if you understand the link between trade deficit and economic growth, so there is no clear link between the two, students. A strong trade surplus doesn't necessarily mean strong economic growth. A case in point is Japan, for example. It has run a significant trade surplus for most of the past several decades, yet its economy has been stuck in low gear most of the time. And Germany too generally runs a strong trade surplus but registers mediocre economic growth. So students, usually people have this misconception that if a country runs a trade surplus, it's doing very good economically. It has strong economic growth. No, not necessarily. And a case in point is Japan and of course Germany. Two countries with very high trade surplus and yet very average or mediocre economic growth. If you look at US, as opposed to this, US, some periods of strong economic growth have come at times of surging trade deficit. So even though US has been consistently running a trade deficit vis-a-vis other countries, particularly countries like China, yet students, we know that it is one of the most economically developed and sound countries in the world, right? So there is no clear link between trade deficit and economic growth. If you look at the pros of trade deficit, students, it allows a country to consume more than its production capacities. The advantage, the benefit of trade deficit, that when there's a trade deficit, a country naturally is importing more, right? So it allows a country to consume more than its production capacities. It helps nations to avoid any shortfall in goods. That means countries do not experience like a deficit or a shortfall of things. If they want something, they import it, right? And the consumers, of course, have this wide range of choice available to them. It provides the countries with a comparative advantage when such countries are involved in trade. It is beneficial as a whole for increasing global wealth, students, right? So it provides this comparative advantage, students. That means countries produce what they are good at, what they can produce competitively, and they import what they are not efficient at. So that means they put the best use of their resources. They put their resources to the best use, students, right? By producing what they're good at and importing what they're not good at. And it makes sense also. So it is not a good, it is not necessarily, like I said, a bad idea to run a trade deficit. It allows generating more foreign direct investment. And of course, that is a huge benefit. If we talk about the negatives or the downside of trade deficit, students, so more jobs are outsourced as domestic industries shrink with less demands when demand for foreign goods increases, right? This. Yeah. So more jobs are outsourced, students. So it is believed, students, now please pay attention to this very important point. It is believed that when countries are importing more, that means their domestic industries, they are underperforming, right? It leads to shrinking of the domestic industries or not an expansion of the domestic industries. That means it can negatively impact employment generation within a country, right? As domestic industries shrink with less demand when demand for foreign good increases. In the form of attracting foreign investment due to trade deficit, the country may end up providing ownership of its resources. And of course, when you're inviting countries to foreign countries to invest in your country, you are giving them the ownership of your domestic resources. Foreigners own your domestic resources, right? A higher trade deficit leads to a decrease in the value of the local currency. And this is one of the most important points we have to make in today's video, that a higher trade deficit has a negative spiraling effect, a downward impact on the value of the local currency, that the local currency, the domestic currency of a country that loses its value, it weakens when a country consistently runs trade deficit. Now, students, the first point that I made about, one drawback of running a trade deficit is the shrinking of the domestic industries, the domestic economy, leading to the loss of jobs, right, or negative employment generation. This view of trade deficit is behind much of the complaints among US politicians about bilateral US trade deficits. So I wanted to, draw your attention to this point, that this is one of the worst impact of running a trade deficit, of rising imports, employment issues, students, right? And this is the main reason why the citizens of US have been consistently complaining of US running a trade deficit. And this was the situation which Trump wanted to correct. And this was, in fact, the whole situation that led to the US-China trade war, wherein Trump at a point became very serious-minded about taking some strict steps for reducing the trade deficit that US runs with other countries. Now, students, this is the last point, that why does a trade deficit weaken the currency, students, right? Now, students understand this, that the trade deficit means that if I take India's case here, trade deficit would mean that India is buying more goods and services than it sells abroad, right? So it is buying more goods, right? Which means it is spending more foreign capital, foreign exchange, than it is earning, right? Now, just like an individual or a firm, a country also needs credit to spend more than its income, right? So if India needs foreign exchange reserves in order to fund its imports, it will have to earn it or arrange it or borrow it, right? So how would it do this? It would do this by borrowing from foreigners. So foreigners finance the trade deficit by lending to Indians or by investing in India, right? So we would borrow from abroad or we would try and attract FDI. However, at some future date, the trade deficit must turn into surplus so that the foreigners get paid back, students. But this borrowing from abroad cannot go on indefinitely, right? After a point, the lenders, people who have lent to us, they would expect returns for their investment or for their lendings, isn't it? So that means they need to be paid back. So for this, the country will have to turn the trade deficit into surplus. It will have to earn the foreign exchange beyond a point, students, right? So borrowing is just a stopgap arrangement. It is just a ad hoc interim arrangement. After a point, the country will have to amp up its resources, its productive energies into producing goods and exporting them. So this trade deficit will need to turn into a surplus, right? So import must fall and export must rise, students. Now, the most important point, for imports to fall and for exports to rise, what is necessary? So one way of making this adjustment is that by depreciating the currency, students, right? So one way of one interim arrangement is, you can say, devaluation, right? If the situation becomes very, like if it turns into a crisis, the way Sri Lanka has devalued its currency. The other way is the, like when the market plays its invisible hand, is when the rupee depreciates or the currency depreciates on its own. So one way this adjustment can take place if the rupee depreciates, making imports more expensive for Indians and exports cheaper for foreigners, right? So the main point that I would like to make here is that for this trade deficit situation to correct, students, it is important that the currency depreciates. And it is precisely for this reason that when countries run a trade deficit, the rupee depreciates or the currency depreciates, right? Now, what would this do? This would make the imports expensive and the exports cheaper for foreigners. I'm repeating, when the currency depreciates, what happens? It makes the imports expensive and it makes the exports cheaper. So if our imports become expensive because of currency depreciation, we would import less naturally, right? And if our exports become cheaper because of currency depreciation, the foreigners would buy more of our exports, isn't it? Because our exports would become competitive vis-a-vis the exports of other countries, the products of other countries. So our exports would increase. Very quickly, I'll explain it through this example, students. $1 is equal to rupees 80. Let's say we're almost approaching that. $1 is equal to rupees 80, students, right? Now say an American wants to buy an Indian chocolate. Okay. Now the chocolate costs rupees 80. So in exchange of $1, the foreigner will be able to buy one chocolate when $1 is equal to rupees 80. Okay. Now let's say $1 becomes rupees 90. That means our currency depreciates, it loses value, and now $1 has rupees 90. $1 is equivalent to rupees 90. Now the foreigner can buy one chocolate plus two toffees for $1. Now look, earlier he was buying one chocolate for $1 when $1 was equal to rupees 80. Now that $1 is equal to rupees 90, he can buy one chocolate plus two toffees, right? That means when our currency depreciates, our exports increase because foreigners are able to buy more products, more of our exports for the same amount of money, right? And our products become competitive vis-a-vis the products of other countries. As opposed to this, if say $1 is equivalent to rupees 70, our currency appreciates, our currency becomes stronger, right? Now $1 has only rupees 70. The foreigner will not be able to buy even a chocolate, right? So one way of correcting this trade deficit is currency depreciation, right? That when the currency depreciates, our imports become expensive. So the volume of imports reduces and our exports become cheaper. So the exports rise. However, students, if trade deficits are sufficiently large and unsustainable, economists believe that they will be associated with a weakening currency at some future date, students, right? So in other words, the trade deficit might not have an impact on currency immediately in the short term. However, over the long term, it would certainly lead to a weakening of currency as it is happening in India's case, right? So students, to summarize, India has been running a trade deficit for many months now. It has always doubled to what it was last year. As a result of this, students, India is approaching a worrisome BOP situation, right? And most importantly, it is leading to weakening of our currency. So that's all for this video, students. I'll see you again with another video next week. Thank you so much.